Right now, we're moving on to our next speaker. His name is Mario Garcia. He's an open source contributor and a GitLab hero. So, guys, it's going to be really exciting. Keep up and get as much information as you can. Hello, Mario. How are you today?
Hi, Julia. Fine. Excited to be joining this amazing event.
We're very happy to see you. How's the weather there? We're all connected from very warm parts of the earth, so I hope our snowy places are not very jealous of us.
Well, I'm in Mexico, in the south of Mexico, so it's hot here.
That's amazing. I hope you have your AC running as I do. And are you ready to kickstart your speech and give our audience a huge thumbs up? Okay, guys, looks like Mario is getting ready. I hope you are comfortable and all prepared as well. We're starting with Mario. Take the stage. Thank you.
Well, I already shared my screen, but okay. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here sharing with the Python community. I'm Mario Garcia. You can find me on Twitter as MarioGMD. Well, what I'm going to talk about is one way that you can replicate your Python dev environments, especially if you have to install all of the tools that you're using for building applications on another computer. And if that computer is using another operating system, one way to have uh, your Python dev environment installed on different devices and different operating systems without having to install everything manually is to use virtual environments. But today I'm going to talk about Vagrant. Vagrant is a tool for building and managing virtual environments. It works on top of Virtualbox. If you are already familiar with virtualization, you probably know VirtualBox, Hyper-V, Docker of VMware. As those are the technologies that Vagrant use as providers for having the virtual environment configured. And if you want to install and configure the tools that you will be using for building applications, you have to use any of the provisioning tools that Vagrant has support for, like use like shell scripts, tools like Ansible, Chef, or Puppet. I'm not going to talk about all of these tools, but I want to share how you can configure your virtual environment with this tool, with Vagrant, and how you can install all of the tools that you will be using for your developing environment. So Vagrant has support for these providers, these technologies as providers, has support for VirtualBox, VMware, Hyper-V, Amazon Web Services, Docker. You can also use Docker as provider and as a provisioning tool. Well, talking about VirtualBox, is one of the most popular virtualization software. It supports Windows, Mac, Linux, Solaris as host, and it has support for ISO and box images for configuring the virtual machine. These are the systems that you can install VirtualBox on. You can use all of these Linux distributions as host for the virtual environment that you will be configuring. I'm talking about Linux as I have more experience using Linux, but you can install Vagrant and VirtualBox on Mac or Windows. And both technologies has enough documentation so you don't have any problem for installing both applications. First, we have to install VirtualBox, and then Vagrant for start configuring our developing environment. So these are some of the Linux distributions that you can install VirtualBox on. And apart from these distributions, you can also install Vagrant, well, VirtualBox on operating systems that has these versions of the Linux kernel. So depending on the operating system that you are using, you can go to the downloads page and download the installer for your operating systems. You can also find instructions for installing on Linux distributions. You can download VirtualBox from the repositories of some distributions like Arch-based. You can also add the official repositories to Debian-based distributions or RPM-based operating systems like Fedora, CentOS. Boxes are the official package format for Vagrant environments. There are some Linux distributions that provide with official boxes for configuring and using with Vagrant, but you can download boxes from vagrantapp.com. If you go to this URL, you type the operating system that you want to use, you will find the instructions for adding the box to the configuration of your environment. You can also go to vagrantbox.es. Well, talking about provisioning is the way that we install and configure additional tools on our development environment. The boxes are available with minimal configuration, but if you need specific tools, depending on the project that you will be building, for example, talking about Python, some of the tools that I use when building applications with this technology are PyM for managing the versions of Python that I will be using for every project, and I use Poetry for managing the dependencies of the project. So if I want to install these tools and configure them properly, I have to use any of the provisioning tools that Vagrant has support for. You can use Bash scripts, you can use Ansible, Chef, or Puppet. For example, if I want to install PyM and Poetry, these are the instructions that I have to write in the Bash script. First, I have to update the list of packages in the repositories of the distributions I will use. The example I will explain, for example, I will explain I'm using Ubuntu, but you can use any other distributions. Fedora, CentOS, Debian, Ubuntu, and Arch are some of the Linux distributions that have official Vagrant boxes that you can use for configuring your environment. But here, this example is running on a Ubuntu box. I have to update the list of packages in the repositories, then install the dependencies of Python and Poetry, install Python using the command that is listed on the official documentation, configuring the bash RC file for the system to recognize the command. And after that, install Poetry. This is just an example. Depending on the tools that you require, you can modify this file and add the instructions for installation and configuration. Well, to install Vagrant, you should go to vagrantup.com/downloads and download the package for Mac, for Windows, for some Linux distributions like CentOS, depending on the operating system that you will be using as host. Some Linux distributions already have Vagrant in the repositories, like the Debian-based distributions, including Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch-based. I'm using Endeavor OS, that is an Arch-based distribution, and Vagrant is already available from the repositories of the operating system that I'm using. These are the instructions that you can run in the Linux terminal for installing Vagrant in some Linux distributions. For CentOS, there is not any package available for installing directly from the repositories, but you can download the installer, and using DNF, that is the package manager of CentOS and Fedora, you can install Vagrant. Some basic commands. These are some of the most used commands of Vagrant. Well, at least these are the ones that you will be using most of the time. Vagrant init, what this command does is to create a Vagrant file. Vagrant file is a file that contains the configuration for your environment. But something that we should take into account is that when you run Vagrant init, it will create a Vagrant file with basic configuration, but it also will add some comments that contains information about the settings that you can change for Vagrant. I will show you some of the settings that you can change. But if you don't want the comments to be available in your Vagrant file, you can create a minimal configuration by running Vagrant init with the option minimal. If you already configure your environment, you can start the virtual environment by running Vagrant opt. And for every Vagrant environment configure, the way to access your virtual environment is through an SSH connection. And for that, you have to run Vagrant SSH. It won't ask you for user and password. That is the way that Vagrant works. If you use Docker, you have to specify in the Vagrant file the user and password for accessing your environment. But in general, you don't have to provide that information. Well, Vagrant how is the command that you have to run if you want to stop the virtual environment. And Vagrant destroy is for deleting the virtual machine that is created after running Vagrant init. And Vagrant opt, if you want to configure your environment again, I would recommend that you run Vagrant destroy first after configuring again your Vagrant box. And finally, Vagrant box, that is the command that you can use for managing the boxes that you will be using for configuring your environment. These are some of the most used commands. Vagrant box add for adding the box to the configuration. Vagrant box remove for removing it. And Vagrant box update if there is an update available. Every time you run Vagrant up, Vagrant will check if there is an update available for the box that you're using. But if you don't want to, but if you don't want that Vagrant check if there is an update available every time you run Vagrant up, you can disable this in the Vagrant file by modifying one option in the configuration file. Well, time to configure our first virtual environment. I'm using Debian for this example, but you can use the operating system that you are more familiar with or the one that you require for your configuration. First, I have to create a new directory and change to that directory. Initialize the configuration. I'm using the official image for Debian. This is the latest version available of Debian. And this is how the Vagrant file will look like. Just 3 lines to specify the box that you will be using for configuring your environment. After that, initialize your environment and then access using an SSH connection. And you will see something similar in the terminal of the or command line of the operating system that you're using as host. Here you have your environment installed and configured. But if you want to add additional tools like PipeN or Poetry for building Python applications, we are going to create a bash script. You can change the name to whatever you want. And now you have to modify Vagrant file for telling Vagrant that you are using a bash script for provisioning your environment. And this file must be created in the directory where the Vagrant file is available. And this option is set to false because if you when all of the instructions are run, when Vagrant starts configuring your environment by running this script, you can provide user or password for the root user. So it is necessary to disable that option. So if you don't disable this option, it will try to ask you for a password, but you can provide this information for the way that Vagrant is designed to work on. And well, another option for configuring your environment is by using Docker. Docker has enough documentation so you won't have any problem installing and your configuring Docker on your operating system. There is information available for Windows, for Linux, and Mac. And for Linux, there are specific instructions for some Linux distributions like Ubuntu. And after installing Docker on your operating system, you have to create the Docker group and add your user to this group. And if you want to configure your terminal, the terminal that you are using at the moment of installing Docker and running these commands, you have to run these instructions for updating the configuration of the system. And if you want to check if Docker is configured correctly, just run this command that will download a Docker image and will show you, will print a message in the terminal. You have to run these commands as we require that Vagrant execute all the commands for building your custom Docker image. We have to create a custom Docker image for that, or we can use a Docker image hosted on Docker Hub, or you can create your custom Docker image by creating a Docker file, and Vagrant will run these commands. So we have to add your user to Docker so Vagrant can have permissions for running these commands without having to running with the root users, or having to append the sudo command before the instructions that you will run. So now it's time to modify the Vagrant file. At this time we are using another technology as provider. We have to modify Vagrant file to specify what is the provider we are using. You can use a Docker image just by specifying the name of the image as it is published on Docker Hub. You can also use GitLab for creating your custom Docker image, or you can create a Docker file with the instructions for configuring your environment. And if you see this line, here I'm telling Vagrant that this is the Docker image that I will use. But if I will be using a Docker file, this is the option that I have to set in the configuration file to specify that Vagrant has to run Docker for building the custom Docker image that we are creating. A Docker file will look something similar to this example. This is based on an example available in the documentation of Docker, but what it's doing is installing an SSH server installing sudo as we need to add the user that we are going to create to the sudo group, and the user that we are creating that is named Vagrant doesn't require to use a password for running commands with root permissions. Then we have to add Vagrant to the sudo group and change the configuration in the sudoers file. And change the permission of the personal directory to the and assign this permission, the ownership to the Vagrant user. And then change the password, as this is the password that Vagrant will use for accessing the environment through the SSH connection. And then we change the configuration for the SSH server to work. And we have to open the port 22, that is the port that we generally use with SSH servers. For this second example, I'm using an official Docker image of Ubuntu, but you can use another one. And then we have to modify the configuration settings in the Vagrant file. We have to assign a name to the host name. We have to specify the user and the username and password. Tell Vagrant that we are going to build a custom Docker image from a Docker file, and that the Docker container we are creating must remain running. And we tell Vagrant that we already configured an SSH server. And after adding these settings to the Vagrant file, we have to tell Vagrant that we are using a bash script for provisioning our environment. And the bash script is the same that we see before. And now we initialize the virtual environment, and we connect to the environment through the SSH connection. And this is what you will see in the terminal or the command line. And why are we doing all of this configuration? Vagrant and Virtualbox, you can install both in different operating systems. It has support for Ubuntu, for Linux, for Mac. And if we want to configure a Python development environment in all of these different operating systems, it's more simple to configure a virtual environment, as we only have to install these tools, and you don't have to install any additional tool for making Python works properly on your operating system. If you go to the official documentation of Python, you will see that if you want to install on Mac or Windows, you have to download the installers. But if you're using Linux, you probably get Python already installed, or you can install it from the repositories. But if you want to use additional tools like Pipe and Poetry, the installation process will be different on every operating system. And we will expend so much time doing this. So that's why we use virtual environment for configuring our Python and the tools that we will be using for building applications in a friendly way. Well, if you have any questions, um, just let me know. But let me tell you that you can find me on Twitter, but also have a profile on that. I've been writing about this topic and other topics that you may find interesting. So go to my profile and see some of the blog posts that I already published. I'm planning to write more about Python, so stay tuned. And if you have any specific questions but don't want to ask now, you can send me an email also. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary. We appreciate you being with us. And actually, we have a couple of questions from the audience right now that I believe we can cover before we start our joint Q&A. How about that?
Yeah, that would be great.
Great. Thank you.